Hello and welcome. This video is my review of Dr. P.H. Martin's Spectralite liquid acrylic ink in Magenta. So I got this one bottle of ink containing 1 US fluid ounces or about 30 milliliters of ink quite a while ago. And when I tried it for the first time, I didn't like it because it was harder to clean off of a metal nib as opposed to traditional ink that's based on gum arabic. But recently I tried using it again and I actually love it. So this bottle, even though it's small, it lasts for a very long time, at least the way I use it. It works fantastic with a dip pen. I tried using it with a dip pen with a metal nib and also with a glass dip pen. You can get very fine lines and you usually won't get any globs falling out of the dip pen because the ink is too watery. For the most part, it functions beautifully. I will say though that when you use this bottle with a dip pen, because the opening is pretty small, it can be a little bit inconvenient to put the dip pen inside of this bottle. So what I usually do is I tilt the bottle and turn over the dip pen to get the ink. But I think that the smartest thing to do would be to get like a little glass ink well and to take out only some of the ink and to use that ink well instead of using this bottle directly. I use this ink on different surfaces. I used it on watercolor paper, for example, and it works beautifully on watercolor paper. I heard in the past about ink artists that work on watercolor paper, and now I know why. Because watercolor paper is very sturdy, it's very strong, it doesn't get damaged when you use a metal nib over it, and it can handle moisture very easily. And it's also very thick. So it's a wonderful paper to use with ink. So you can see in the light that since this ink is very glossy and the paper is matte, the light hits only the ink. And I find that to be fascinating and beautiful. I really love that. I haven't seen any ink as glossy as this one. You can also see that in some places, the ink is a little bit raised over the surface, and I really like that. You can get that effect if you use a metal nib dip pen that sometimes applies more ink more generously. With a glass dip pen, I found that you don't get this raised texture as easily. And it'll also depend on the paper you're working on. So for example, if you apply this ink using a metal nib over an acrylic background, you will get that raised surface effect much more easily because the acrylic paint doesn't absorb any of the ink and the ink just sits above the surface. This ink, just like many inks, is transparent. Generally speaking, most inks are transparent except for white and black. Here you can see that I applied the ink over an acrylic background, which is kind of a messy dry brush, and you can really see through the ink, which I think is very beautiful. And here I applied the ink on a similar messy dry brush background, and I applied it using a brush. So it's flatter on the paper, but you can see through it, and I think that's a really beautiful effect that you can get with transparent inks that you can't get with an opaque ink or an opaque paint, which will just look flat on the surface. Another good thing, in my opinion, about this ink is that it dries quite fast. So it doesn't dry so fast that I wished it would dry more slowly so that I'll have more working time with it. But it dries fast enough so that if I'm working in one area and then I move to another area, the first area is already dry and there's less of a chance of me smearing my work when I'm moving around on the page. Also, if you just want your ink to dry in order to apply, for example, watercolor over it, or maybe color it in with a marker, then it dries pretty fast, and I find that to be pretty convenient. This ink is supposed to be waterproof, so let's test that out. Here's a little bit of watercolor that I'm applying over the ink after it's dried, and indeed there is no bleeding. The ink stays just where it is. It doesn't stain the watercolor that's applied over it. I tried the same thing with just clear water and the ink doesn't run at all. So it is completely waterproof for applying watercolor onto it. I also wanted to test and see what happens when I color over this ink using an alcohol-based marker. In this case, I'm using a Pro marker. To my surprise, the alcohol-based marker very easily dissolves this ink. And so this ink is not alcohol proof. Here I'm testing a water-based marker. This is the Faber-Castell Pitt Artist Pen. It's water-based, it's not alcohol-based. This marker is fine to use on this ink. Finally, I wanted to test another alcohol-based marker, the Copic marker. I'm using a gray marker, and you can see that it easily dissolves this ink and that this ink is not alcohol proof. So I hope that this review gave you a good idea about this specific acrylic ink and possibly acrylic inks in general. It's the only acrylic ink I currently own, and if I get any other ones, I will be happy to review them as well. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already done so, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.